Today's speaker, Shwetak Patel, and he's here to talk about how compassion improves innovation. Shwetak's presentation is in honor of Vikram Jandalaya, whose vision for inclusive innovation is the inspiration for this talk. Vikram passed away earlier this year. Shwetak Patel is the Washington Research Foundation Entrepreneurship Endowed Professor in Computer Science and Engineering and Electrical and Computer Engineering at the University of Washington. His research interests are in the areas of human-computer interaction, ubiquitous computing, sensor-enabled embedded systems, and user interface software and technology. Dr. Patel received the MacArthur Foundation Fellowship in 2011, is a 2012 Sloan Fellow, received a TR35 Award in 2009, and was named Top Innovator of the Year by Seattle Business Magazine, was named Newsmaker of the Year by Seattle Business Journal, and was the recipient of the Microsoft Research Faculty Fellowship in 2011. Most recently, Dr. Patel was named the recipient of the 2018 ACM Prize in Computing, which recognizes an early to mid-career fundamental innovative contribution in computing that, through its depth, impact, and broad implication, exemplifies the greatest achievements in the discipline. Please join me in welcoming Shwetak Patel.
Great, thank you for that introduction. It's always kind of embarrassing to hear those things because a lot of those awards are actually not because of me, it's because of my grad students and my students and everybody that I've worked with. But so today I want to talk about how compassion improves innovation. So Vikram Jandalaya was scheduled to give this final presentation, but I have the honor of actually delivering it. And so this is in honor and memory of Vikram. And he really stood for inclusive design and innovation, innovation in general, and compassion. So this is actually an interesting lecture and presentation because I'm not going to tell you about exactly how to start a company or how to do something that's very tactical in terms of innovating or starting a company, but more around a different mindset around how compassion can drive the work that you're doing and the companies that you're starting and the kinds of companies that you want to build. And then when I was working on these slides and also reflecting on kind of my career, I've been a serial entrepreneur, spun out a number of different companies out of the university, and when I reflect back, it was the theme of a lot of the work I did kind of comes back to this notion of compassion. It was really compassion that actually drove a lot of the innovative work that I've been able to do in the past around sustainability, healthcare, and even safety. And so this really resonates. So this will be an interesting way to kind of tease apart the work that I've done in the past, but also work that others have done to basically try to get at how compassion can drive innovation. So, what is innovation? So this is one of the first questions I always get when I get interviewed or a student asks me about innovation, like how do I innovate? And that's a fairly nebulous question. But, the way that I've often thought about innovation is a couple of different ways. One way that I often think about innovation is that, if somebody, if you have an idea and somebody doesn't disagree with you, then it's probably not innovative, right? If I'm trying to build something that's going to do something and somebody that may know a little bit about that area is like, that's kind of impossible. That's probably not going to work. It's probably not an innovative topic if everybody universally agrees that that's doable, right? That means that there's something incremental there, or that means that something's already been invented. And often at this point, in terms of technology and a lot of the things that we look at and we build, it's been invented. At some point, somebody's thought about that concept. So reinventing the wheel is this concept that you often hear about, but actually innovation is really around addressing something for the masses, right? Taking the intersection of one thing that's been invented, another thing that's emerging, and looking at that intersection is where innovative work can happen. And that could be addressing something for the masses, or actually it could be addressing something for a small number of people, but having a huge impact on that small cohort or that small number of people, right? So really think about innovation from that standpoint. Is that, are you doing the impossible, or are you creating looking at the intersection of something that just has never been explored before? So when we think about compassion, you got to really start with empathy first. Some people say compassion and empathy are the same thing. Really, they're actually a little different. They're technically synonyms if you look at the definition, but they're actually different in my mind. All right. So when you think about empathy, so looking at how you put yourself into somebody's, in somebody's situation, being able to empathize in terms of understanding where they're coming from, how they're feeling. Empathy permeates our society altogether. I have a 3-year-old and a 6-year-old at home, and empathy is the #1 key to get out of a tantrum, right? Because you've got to be able to appreciate where they're coming from before you try to address that. And so empathy is all around us, and we often take that for granted, and even take it for granted in terms of when we're innovating. And so, innovation really starts with being able to listen to someone's story. It's so easy, and I contend with this all the time, where you take an interesting concept or a technology and you run 100 miles per hour towards building that technology, and you're super excited about that technology. But if you haven't taken that step back, then you've developed something that has a complete mismatch with what society can benefit from, what people care about, or what the right intersection is. If you think about startup success, there's a lot of things. There's like market risk and all the technology risk. But the hardest thing to really figure out is that market risk, right? How do you de-risk that? But if you haven't really been able to show empathy, being able to understand the stories of the people that you're trying to develop towards, you really can't de-risk that. And so being able to listen to somebody's story is absolutely critical. And we preach this in human-computer interaction and in design work, where you're doing the formative work to really figure out what people want and where they're coming from. And the way you ask yourself this is, what would it be like being in their shoes, right? So just some examples of kind of how I do this in the research world. So my lab does a lot of research in healthcare. And healthcare is a pretty gory area. There's a lot of challenges in healthcare. And it's really tough for a computer science graduate student or electrical engineering graduate students to really appreciate the challenges of healthcare unless you go native or actually go in there and try to understand what's happening. Every single one of my graduate students either takes the initiative or takes on the role of collecting data themselves alongside clinicians, going into the patient's rooms to be able to see what they're actually struggling with, actually working with patients to figure out, well, what is the problem at heart? Not just throwing a machine learning algorithm right at it, not just building a sensor right at it. It's really appreciating where people are coming from. So going native and being able to feel like what it feels like to be in their shoes is absolutely critical. And that's something that has been really important for all the work that we've done in my projects and research. And one of the first companies I spun out was Zensi, which was an energy monitoring company that got acquired by Belkin probably at this point 8 years ago. And one of the things that we did a lot of work on was appreciating how people think about energy, their mental model of energy and sustainability. Because we assume that, if you give them a spreadsheet of where their energy is going, they're going to change their behavior. It's not true. It's not how it works at all. It's really appreciating what it means for them. And it turns out it's not the same for everybody. So when we're developing for low-income households, what they cared about was getting to that particular subsidized number where if you go over 100 kilowatts for that month, then the charge is actually much higher. Whereas somebody else that might have the means to be able to pay for the electricity have a very different motivation. They want to upgrade their appliances that are energy efficient. So you have this disconnect in terms of what you're building the technology for and who you're building it for, but you really have to figure out who the stakeholders are and where they're coming from. I actually became the licensed electrician and plumber to do some of that work, is to really appreciate what the physical infrastructure even looks like, right? So being able to look at it from somebody's perspective there is really critical. And this is something that you should think about across the board. And it doesn't matter. So one of the things that people often say is, well, I don't work in a company or a business, or my business is a B2C business. And who are the shoes that I'm looking at? There's stakeholders there. It applies to every single thing you do. It doesn't have to just be a consumer offering. It doesn't have to just be a B2B or B2C. Everybody has a stakeholder as a part of your company that you're looking at. And I think that's what you really need to appreciate. So empathy is an interesting one. So this is kind of odd. It's like, oh my gosh, these are companies that show empathy? They do. So empathy is basically appreciating and understanding where people are coming from. And if you look at some of the biggest successes, the core contribution of the innovations that they've created and the things that people have built and these companies have built that people can't live without is because they did that, right? If you think about what Amazon has revolutionized around Prime, like the fact that you can get something instantaneously, like it took a while from a technology standpoint to innovate and logistically to innovate, but they really resonated with what people really needed and wanted in terms of you want to live your life in a seamless possible way where you're distracted on going and getting these things, and being able to have things that are available in real time really innovated they innovate in terms of packages, but also material, online content. If you think about the iPhone, like, there's this saying that if you ask somebody what the mobile phone of the future would be, if you did the formative work, they would never have invented the iPhone, right? They would never have known. But being able to see where that trajectory is and being able to appreciate where people are coming from and where people might be going, that has actually been a critical thing for a lot of these companies. Search was a fundamental thing that Google innovated on, which was, well, where do I get information? How do I make it easier? Information is the key to what a lot of people are yearning for, and so how do you make that easier? Right? So empathy permeates across all of this, and you don't often think about that, but it is. It is a key part of the success for many of these companies. But the challenge is that, to what end, right? So a lot of times when you've hit that sweet spot where you basically figured out the need, you've created a capability where people can't live without, but then where do you go next, right? Then it becomes a little challenging, right? Then sometimes companies or innovators get a little conservative, all right? It's like, okay, this is working now. Now let's not disrupt the main business and start to do something that enhances the business a little bit, but not really innovate past that. So this is a big struggle for large companies, right? This is often a struggle. And so, you have these things. The smart home of the future is kind of interesting. But think about it. I mean, now you're getting to a point where you're innovating maybe for a very small portion of the population. And so how do you try to take a step back from that? So these are hard problems to solve, but at the same time, you're only solving a very small piece of the problem that might be much more aligned with your current company, but you're not being able to have that broader impact. And they often, when you start to get conservative, you get incremental as well. And so this is a challenge that often companies face. But when you're starting a new venture, or when you're starting a new effort, or you have the ability to influence the roadmap of a company, that's when you start to take a step back and show how empathy could actually have a big impact there. But empathy by itself is not enough, right? So this is one world that you can imagine emerging, but the question is, well, what can we do to go beyond that? How do we think about the problems in different ways that allows us to innovate in new ways that we can break through some of the stagnation that could happen if you apply the same old techniques? So this is where compassion comes in. So if we really want to solve problems that go beyond what technology has done to date or innovations has done to date, compassion is what's going to actually inspire innovation that can actually change the world. So these are some examples. The example on the bottom is something that was actually innovated here at UW. And so if you think about these kinds of problems, it requires a very different way of thinking about the problem altogether. You have to show empathy, obviously, but it's empathy plus compassion. Being able to show compassion towards the stakeholders, to the problem domain, and quite frankly, being able to solve the problem because you're showing compassion and you actually care about the domain, the problem, and not because of the financial rewards at the end of it, is what actually allows you to innovate in these domains. And one of the things that's so hard to get across people is that by showing compassion and empathy, you will potentially reap the benefits at the end. If you optimize for the financial gain, you have a very different trajectory that you can actually go towards. It's fine. You can build a sustainable business that way. But compassion plus empathy is a different path, but you can potentially still reap those benefits later on, right? And the nice thing about this path, or the potentially interesting thing about this path, is it could be more rewarding while you're going through it. You can engage new individuals. You can look for diversity in thought. It's a different path going towards it. All right? And I'll talk about some examples of this in terms of kind of what I've seen in the community at large that I've been inspired by from work in this space. But this is an absolute critical component, is that compassion plus empathy allows you to solve these problems. So let me talk about a particular example. So this is the picture of the individual here. His name is Anupam Pathak. So Anupam is the co-inventor of Liftware. All right? So Liftware was something that came out for a while ago. I think it was like 5, 6, maybe 7 years ago. So Anupam had this mission that he wanted to address, global challenges and all these kinds of problems. And one of the areas he kind of started to work in was an area in Parkinson's. So looking at how do you address people with Parkinson's disease. So you have things like hand tremors, unintentional hand tremors. It's an area that he was interested in. He spent a significant amount of his time working with caregivers, patients that have been diagnosed, the family members of those patients, to really understand before he built that first piece of technology in terms of what that domain was like, and actually, went in to try to figure out what the needs were before he built anything. So he built this prototype on the left as an example of a spoon that he basically built, where he found that the biggest fundamental issue was just nutrition. It was really hard for people to eat. So if you think about hand trimmers, and if you have if you're scooping something from a bowl, just being able to eat a spoonful of food is really difficult. It's also stigmatizing too. When you're at a restaurant, when you're out and about, it was really hard for people to actually go out and be able to go to a restaurant. And so he looked at a number of different innovations that he built towards, but one of it was the spoon. In this case, interesting technology happened to mate with a need. And the technology that he prototyped and built was a spoon that was self-balancing. So you have the spoon, and no matter how your hand is moving, the spoon is always balanced, right? So you can take that bite without anything falling down, and you can have the spoon with you, right? You just have it with you, and you can have a normal conversation. You can actually interact with somebody while we're eating. And so, but this took a long time. This took many years to innovate on. After he made enough progress, this company actually got acquired by Google. So Google acquired this company, and it's actually part of Verily right now. And I actually have the privilege of working with Anupam at Google. And Anupam, when I talk to him, it's amazing the way that he interacts. So he is a prototypical compassionate innovator in my mind. So when I talk to him about a problem, the first thing he goes to is like, well, who am I developing and designing towards? Secondly, can I go talk to them? Can I go talk to the people that care for them? And so he's doing a lot of healthcare work at Google, and those are the first questions he asks. He's a technologist. He can literally build anything. He can build hardware, software. He's an expert in machine learning, but that's how he approaches the problems. And he's reaped the benefits. At this point, his technologies that he's built beyond some of this has impacted many, many people. In fact, the way he approaches this problem galvanizes people around him. People are itching to be on his team. I have to beat people down and say, no, you can't be on his team. Not everybody can be on Anupam's team. Because the spirit that he has brings in great like-minded people. So it's not just the technology at the end. It's not reaping the benefits at the end. It's really the process that he's created has really gotten people excited about it. All right? And so this is one example of how the combination of compassion and empathy can come together. Then you think about the opposite, right? If you have empathy without compassion, so this is kind of a dangerous area. So if you have so much empathy for a particular set of stakeholders or society or for your customers or however you want to think about it, you can actually get too far, right? Think about like gaming, right? Gaming, like Fortnite, it's been this interesting rage right now. But at the same time, think about the side effects of that. What about RSI, repetitive stress injuries? Is that something that we often think about? Probably not, right? If you think about developing a technology, the unintentional consequences or the side effects are something that we don't often think about, right? But if you think about a philosophical mind shift change within your organization where compassion is interwoven within the framework of how you operate, and it's a philosophical pillar, then you think about it differently. Then you have this balanced view of gaming plus the side effects of that, right? And how do you balance that out, right? So, and when you think about that, you can have an even bigger impact. Like Fortnite already has a big impact on society in many ways, but you can imagine how that could be balanced out to have an even bigger impact, right? So this is something that can also often be dangerous, and something we often take that for granted. Security and privacy ends up being one of these things, right? It's this side effect, it's this afterthought. It's like, oh, okay, now let's sprinkle some security and privacy onto our product. No, it has to be an integrated thing, and we've seen the impact of not having that as being an integrated concept while you're developing these technologies and developing these companies and these innovations, right? Security and privacy, in my mind, is kind of one of the biggest examples of not showing compassion. When you've empathized, you've basically shown what people really want and need, but the side effect that a lot of people don't often understand can have dire consequences. So this is something to keep in mind as you're starting to think about projects and roadmaps and as you're starting to build technology. And this is something I alluded to earlier. Sometimes this is really tough. If you think about businesses, like the healthcare industry is an interesting one to think about, right? There's all these competing incentives, right? You have a pharmaceutical company that is incentivized to sell more drugs. They're innovating. They're revolutionizing healthcare from a therapeutic standpoint, but typically to go through FDA clearance for a game-changing drug costs billions of dollars. And how do you balance that out? So there's not an easy answer to this. And so if you think about empathy in terms of what people need, compassion in terms of how do I make this available for everybody at low cost, is often competing. So how do you actually address that? And that's a tough one. I actually don't have an answer to that. But it's something to think about as you start to build your own innovations and as you start to build your own roadmap. I mean, there are ways that societies have started to innovate in this area, right? You might have a pharmaceutical company that has a primary mission to build this revolutionary drug, but you might have a philanthropic organization like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation that wants to scale it globally, right? So there might be organizations that can come together and show compassion, but it's not a trivial one. So this is just something that it permeates all throughout industry and in business right now. But if you think about it, look at, so the example on the right here is the accessible gamepad that Microsoft's been working on. Companies are actually starting to actually move in this direction. So one of the interesting things that's happening, Microsoft, for example, has a whole access computing group now around accessibility, how to make all of the technology that they develop accessible to everybody, right? Google has similar efforts in terms of translate and being able to address the illiterate population. And how do we democratize computing across the world, right? And if you think about it, wow, why are they doing that? You know, one is, if you think about kind of what I talked about earlier, one is that, you know, if you think about your workforce, especially at an established company, what are they motivated to do, right? You know, they may have shipped that great project and product and it's having impact, but really you want to actually one-up that. A lot of these engineers and program and product managers want to go to the next level in terms of having that broader impact. And having impact that goes beyond what you've just done, you have to look at society at large. And so one is just, you know, these are meaningful projects for people. It's what people actually have an inherent need to do. Secondly, when you're innovating with compassion and you're building, like for example, this game controller that's accessible, the side benefit of that is you're actually innovating in a space that can actually have a whole other area that you open up. When you think differently about these projects, you actually open up opportunities to innovate somewhere else. And this is, you see this in the industry quite often, right? Somebody's trying to build this one thing to support this particular population. It turns out getting towards that actually opened up all these other areas that we happen to solve all these other things. So going back to Anupam's example of liftware, right? He focused on Parkinson's. Parkinson's is a decent set of the population, but it's smaller than other healthcare needs out there. But if you think about the side effect of that, well, what did he do? He was able to build a technology that can help for rehabilitation, for robotics. The side effect of that innovation is that it actually had bigger implications than he ever thought. But he focused on this thing that he was showing compassion for that particular patient population. And these companies are doing this now. This is like, at Microsoft, empathy is a major pillar. At Google, empathy is a major pillar. These companies are starting to adopt this. And so I think startups and early companies have a unique ability to really internalize this from the get-go, and it comes out in their product. You know, the reason why Google bought Anupam's company was, yeah, it was great technology, but it wasn't a huge market. It's not like it was going to be this game-changing financial reward. What they saw was, you know what? The way he approaches this problem, I want that approach replicated across the company, like, and that particular org. You know, that's what he was able to demonstrate. So, you know, this leads to this general theme that Vikram really embodied and really pushed on, which was inclusive innovation, right? When you're innovating, this notion of inclusive innovation is absolutely critical right now in society. You know, as I started earlier, a lot of the things, you know, have already been invented. I mean, a lot of these concepts that I often hear about, parts of those things have been invented. But what we haven't really addressed is how those inventions have addressed society at large. And so, you know, innovation marked by a holistic thought and action to drive and manage disruption that will have meaningful, positive, broad societal impact. I mean, that's the key, meaningful and broad societal impact, right? And often it's at odds with the financial gains that are necessary to make progress. But I don't think that's the case. I think you can have a broad societal impact and the other things can fall in place. It is a different path. It is an excruciatingly painful path, but it is a rewarding path. And as you go along that path, there are a lot of things that you will learn that can have this broad, meaningful impact on society. And finally, one way to think about this is communicating with those that are affected. A lot of times, if you are working in a particular domain or with a particular set of stakeholders, then you're kind of siloing yourself with that particular set of customers or that particular population or that particular type of technology or innovation. But really trying to have this kind of broad, holistic view on other stakeholders and looking at how do you communicate effectively to other people that could be impacted, or how you can disseminate what you're doing and evangelize it in a way that it can be more broadly appreciated. I think it's really critical to be able to take the first steps there. Because right now, if you think about innovating within a startup, you have this this tension where you got to focus, focus, focus. The first thing you do is remove all this noise and focus on this, and that really inherently silos you. And so how do you break away from that and being able to try to figure out how can you have this meaningful impact? And that tension is a difficult one. But being able to communicate and figure out mechanisms that allow you to communicate broadly is absolutely necessary to even have this ability to show empathy and compassion. So I will leave it at that, and I'm happy to answer questions. And I want to use the next few minutes to basically just get your thoughts and reactions. This is not there's no formula for this. It's really thinking about how, as you build your roadmaps and companies and innovations, do you infuse this mindset into your endeavors. All right. With that, I'll take questions. Go ahead.
One of the challenges as a UX designer is influencing and getting people to take action on your work, and one thing that's a big thing is numbers and ROI and lift and all that stuff. So how would you overcome that challenge if you were to emphasize your recommendation on this empathy?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, often UX gets the short end of the stick, right? Not just from a resourcing standpoint, but from an influence standpoint. Yes. So the question was, from a UX UI standpoint, often if you're going after ROI and looking at that kind of an impact, how does a UX or a UX designer actually have an impact if you're going for empathy and if you're actually looking at some of the formative work that's happening? So so the challenge is that yes, it's right. UX is often at this, or usually stuck in the middle in terms of here's what the executive goals are, and here's kind of what the goals are in terms of what you found in your formative work. So one way to think about that, and I think that has kind of worked in industry, is that you can actually use that as an opportunity to figure out new areas of exploration that can actually demonstrate additional ROI opportunities. So you don't have to prove those out, but one of the things that I've found effective is that, look, this is where you're trying to go, but you're actually missing out in this particular whole segment where you can actually differentiate yourself, but also actually have equal, if not bigger, impact. So that's an area where I think UX actually plays a big role, where if you think about a lot of times the roadmap is also often very narrowed down because of what engineering can do, but demonstrating other paths of revenue and opportunities is actually something that they'd be open ears for. And that's why when you show empathy, it's like, there's this whole group of stakeholders that we're not even addressing for, but you can open up. And so that's one way to think about that, how to balance the lack of resources, but also kind of going after the ROI, is look, here is another path, and that path could be an interesting one that could move into this direction. Yeah. Go ahead.
Could you explain further the video game? You were talking about how that is empathy but not compassion.
No, yeah. So what I was trying to get at there was that in gaming, so empathy in that sense is like what motivates them? What are they excited about? What's game? A lot of times in video game design, it's like what's the exciting thing? It's like it's storytelling, right? It's like you have to be able to empathize to be able to figure out what people are going to react to. But at the same time, the compassion part is like, okay, now they're playing this video game, they're really into it, they're addicted to this game, but at the same time, what are the unintended consequences of that? So the compassion part comes in, well, what's the side effect of that, right? And one just example was RSI, right? If you're on the video game, you're doing this stuff, there's a physical thing to it, but there's also other impacts of it as well. It's that balance there. Go ahead.
You've done such a great job explaining the empathy versus compassion. I'm curious, how do you recruit for compassion in your employees, and or how do you develop that within your teams or your company?
Oh, that's a great question. So the question was, empathy and compassion. How do you recruit towards compassion, and how do you develop that within a team? That's a pretty hard one. It's hard to find a lot of anapoms, actually, but you can actually cultivate a lot of anapoms. So, so one way to think about this is that sometimes it's hard to kind of interview a candidate and say, oh, that's a compassionate individual. But what I would say is you create a culture and environment, and it's in the air. And that's one way to think about it. Because a lot of times, if you think about junior developers, engineers, program managers, as they come up, it's really the mentorship that happens in that organization that really influences where they go. Right? Mentorship is key for a lot of folks that are entering the industry. And creating that kind of scaffolding and that mentorship that the leadership actually buys into is critical. So I think what I often do is look for the opportunity that they're flexible, right? Do they come in with a flexible mindset, or are they, are they stringent in their ways? The other thing is looking at how they are just people, right? Are they kind? Like kindness is the number one thing. When I hire for people, kindness is like the first thing I look for. Like if they're not kind, it's not going to work. Right? And kindness comes in many different ways, right? You could actually be kind and still be decisive. You can be kind and to say yes to everything, but you could be decisive and kind. But that's the number one thing I look for. And if I see that, then compassion can come out of that. Go ahead.
Can you elaborate on the compassionate business model?
Yeah, so compassion, I would say compassion is not necessarily, I guess, a business model. I think compassion is a way, it's a cultural mind shift within the company to be able to design towards compassion. So I don't think compassion itself is a business model. I think it's the way that you approach the product that you're building or what you're doing within the company, and the output of that is basically shows that the compassion was put into it. But I guess the way I would look at it is compassion a business model, which is your question, or how do you think about compassion as a business model? I don't think you need to go into it that way. I think when you start to go, if you try to do it that way, then you're forcing it too much.
And my follow-up question is, right, at Amazon, we always like metrics driven, right? So how do you measure compassion, make sure that the culture of compassion is actually being tracked or being measured?
Yeah.
Whether we're lacking, whether we're actually...
Yeah, that's a great question. And the question was like, how do we set up metrics that compassion is actually a thing, and how is it actually being infused? That's a difficult one. I mean, just some ideas would be some of the things that my teams try to do is in our OKRs that compassion is an OKR. So you have a key result that the team together comes up with, that they have a key result that shows that this is part of either the product that they're building or what they're doing is demonstrated through that OKR. So through the team you can do that, but you have to make that a top-level OKR. Yeah. Question? Yeah.
Do you think the key difference between compassion and empathy is just that, like, honesty? Because it seems like...
It's a fair point.
Like, empathy is kind of seeing the opportunity and ignoring what the long-term consequences might be, and compassion is just including that in there and saying, should we be empathetic if it leads to this result?
Mm-hmm. No, that's a great way of thinking about it. So the comment was, is compassion really honesty? Empathy is you kind of know what's going on, but you can do that without compassion and build towards something like that. But really, honesty is a key part of it. I think it's a key ingredient to that. Yeah. But I think the other thing about compassion is that I truly believe that some folks show empathy, but it's not because of honesty. It's just that it's not the lack of honesty. It's just the lack of appreciating the unintended or the other side of the puzzle. It's maybe a naivety that happens there. It's not being honest, right? But honesty is a particular one point of that. Yeah. I think compassion is a little broader. Yeah.
And in the social innovation space, they're starting to look at systems thinking. Can you talk a little bit about compassion? They have a lot of similarities, compassions and systems thinking.
Yeah, no, I think it's similar. I think it's very similar. I think the systems thinking and social innovation, it's pretty much very similar. I think it's just a different terminology in terms of that. So the question was, how is it, how is compassion and systems thinking in social innovation, entrepreneurship similar? And I think they are actually similar. It's really taking a broader look at it and applying it more broadly to everything, right? Not just social needs. Yeah. Go ahead.
Is there a way to think about it in terms of like a triple bottom line?
Oh yeah. Yeah. So the question was, is this a way to look at it from a triple bottom line analysis? And quite honestly, a lot of these companies are going down that path, or starting to think about it that way. Because if you look at revenue streams now, you're starting to hit the wall for a lot of these things, right? And you have to look at other opportunities. And this is where I think within leadership in larger companies, they're able to have influences because this is another path, right? So the triple bottom line is potentially a way to get in there. But I don't like that only being the way, but at least it's some way to actually infuse it in there and it actually starts to permeate within the company. Yeah. Anybody else first? Okay, go ahead.
To follow up, do you see any companies like Amazon or Google that are incorporating it as a cultural shift in some way, or probably
It's early, but companies like Microsoft and Amazon, Microsoft and Google, that you know publicly, they are starting to move in that direction. Given where they're moving with their technologies and their products, it's early, but the fact that it is a conversation internally is already a huge change, right? But we'll see. We'll see where it long-term pans out. But we're already seeing those major moves right now. And the challenge right now is that if you think about the technology companies in particular, the tech sector, they're swimming in revenue and cost. So they have this ability to do something a little radical and different, right? But when things get tighter, it'll be interesting to see how it stands the test of time. And so right now is an interesting time to do it experimentally. But how quickly it gets woven into the company is going to be really interesting. Yeah.
So for these companies, you've probably seen companies that did not have this sort of empathetic model and started shifting towards it.
Yep.
What are some of the processes that they did to get towards that goal?
Yeah. So the question was, there's been companies that haven't quite shown this compassion, and they've, have developed products that may not live up to the full standards, having the broader impact and having these negative consequences. And your question, it sounds like, is what do they do to get to that position? I think, it depends. It depends on the company, it depends on the product or the technology or whatever it is. But I mean, at the highest level is kind of what I alluded to earlier, is the whole concept that you can show empathy, you're building towards these individuals, but not understanding and appreciating the full story is what got them there. Right? And the security privacy is the one that I mentioned before, and that one always happens where it was a conscious decision to make that a secondary thing, because the primary goal is to make something that people can't live without. And so if these other things are getting in the way, then that is an impediment to what their primary goal was. But the fact that was an impediment is already kind of showing that they're not being compassionate, right? So I think part of it is just the narrow-mindedness of how they're going to get to the end goal, and they know they can get there quickly, is one of the reasons you can get into this position. And it's so hard to break away from that. I mean, as a startup, it's so hard to do that. So when I spun out my health company, one of the things that I always promised myself was that we will always have a carve-out for our company, the license, everything, that anything that we build from a healthcare standpoint will always be available for royalty-free, perpetual royalty-free access to any global health country for global health, right? Any pandemic, epidemic that ever occurs, we will give it away. It doesn't matter what it is, right? And then whoever were to take on that company would have to abide by that, and they did, and they do. And so it's just, you've got to be able to set that up from the get-go and hold to it. It's hard, but it's something that the earlier you do it, I think the more likelihood that it will get adopted long term for wherever your endeavors go with that particular approach. Yeah. Go ahead.
So I guess it seems like a lot of what we're talking about are externalities and internalities. And and capitalism is really bad at factoring in externalities and taking advantage of being able to pass those off on other people.
Yeah.
Is there a way for a tech company operating in a capitalist system to be able to be compassionate? Because there's the way things are set up. You can choose to have a benefit if you're willing to take the time, but there's never really immediate benefits to taking that road.
Yeah, exactly. So the comment was, in a capitalistic society, it's completely at odds with having a compassionate approach because kind of the incentives and how you would approach it is very different. And I think this is Yeah, I don't have a good response to this other than I think if we think about how companies evolve, I think there's a way for companies to evolve in a way that you can operate in a capitalistic society where you have to be able to show the benefits of, from the revenue standpoint, sustainable, people need to have jobs. But I think there is a dual effort that companies can have if a significant portion of the industry were to move in that direction. So I think this actually happens with sectors. Like, so there are certain sectors in the world where as an industry, they operate this way, and they can succeed that way. So if you think about, certain parts of the food industry or agriculture, there is this kind of dual roles in terms of dual opportunities where you have this revenue model, but you also have these kind of more. The companies are also set up on how we can actually more cost effectively disseminate and get food out there, right? And if an industry together has, or the set of consortium members together have set up these multiple kind of goals, then I think you can succeed in there. But if one company decides to do it and the other one does not, then it falls apart. That's one of the issues. So I think it's really having companies to come together to do it. I mean, you see this a little bit with some of the AI for good efforts where the one thing that these competing tech companies are trying to come together with is like, how do we make sure that AI technology isn't the scary thing that's going to have all these unintended consequences, and it could. But this is like the common ground. They're getting along in this world because they all are going to suffer from this and going to benefit from it. So I think that's how you have to do it. You got to go sector by sector and have them become like-minded and try to solve all of the industry. Yeah.
It seems like you've been talking about doing compassion and bringing it into this process from a top-down kind of approach.
Yeah.
What is your opinion about the validity of trying to do it from a bottom up? In other words, if the consumers start to demand things that are more compassionate.
That's a good question. Yeah. So
then companies have to follow that even if their bottom line is profits.
Yeah.
Because they're not going to have consumers.
Yeah. So the question was, I've been talking about a lot of top down from the company side, maybe employee side, but what about from the consumer side where there's demand for compassion? And that's a great point. I mean, one of the challenges there is how do you educate the consumers to be able to do that? So there's entities and organizations that help from an education standpoint. So I think there is an opportunity as innovators to be able to create mechanisms to disseminate information in ways that you can educate them, right? I mean, think about the whole GDPR movement in Europe, right? That was an educational process that happened to figure out what happens to your data and what you have access to with your data, and that really changed, like from a bottom-up approach on how data is handled in Europe, right? And GDPR is one example of that, but you can imagine that happening across the board. And we have organizations that try to protect consumers, but at the same time, a lot of times that those organizations have both a consumer-facing aspect to it and a corporate-facing aspect to it. So a lot of those times those agencies are stuck in the middle. But you're right. I think there's an opportunity where if we can take on the onus of educating the consumer so they can ask the right questions and make the right demands, I think that is another way to think about it. Yeah. Yes?
Is there another opportunity with employees of companies, though? I'm thinking about Google and how they may influence who Google's customers are.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, I mean, employees, very much so. Like, if you look at some companies, they're very bottomed up, right? I mean, Google's an example of very much the employees have a lot of say. They have a lot of influence. So I think employees right now are actually in a unique position. If you think about the talent that's in these companies, and kind of the creativity in the companies, they have a huge opportunity actually within to drive a lot of that. And this is something that we try to teach our students is that, it doesn't matter if you're just an engineer or PM that's just starting out, you have a huge opportunity to have influence in that company, but it's the right way to direct the kind of your team and being able to kind of be able to bubble those kind of concerns up is hard, and being able to teach people to think about how you actually do that effectively is critical. But employees can have a big impact. And they do, quite often do. But it seems a lot of times employees don't feel empowered because one, it could be the mechanism might not be the right mechanism set up for them, or they might not have the confidence to do it, right? But employees actually have a unique opportunity to do that as well. Yeah. Any other questions? How about remote sites? Yeah. All right, I'll take one more.
Just kind of a broad question. Do you think the government can help shift the landscape to help companies infuse more compassion to their work? Maybe something crazy like redefine how they measure GDP or expand it, include more social metrics?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So the question was, is there, at the federal level or the government level, are there ways to kind of enforce compassion by having different metrics, GDP and looking at compassion? That's I think that's one way of thinking about it, and I think there are other parts of the world and other countries that actually have that as a top-level measure, right? But the challenge there sometimes is that to balance the need of what the companies are going to do and is it there's only so much the government can actually do to force industry to do that, right? But at the same time, there's incentives that could be put into place, right? So it's this positive and negative reinforcement thing. Negative reinforcement doesn't work with these companies. Positive reinforcement might be more effective in moving in that direction. So one way to think about that is this happened in the energy sector a little bit, where the moving in a certain direction actually was a positive for that company, and those companies would actually reap the benefits because consumers were able to jump on top of that and saying, look, this is a responsible organization because they were able to benefit from that. And there was a lot of federal support that actually pushed in that direction. So there are ways to do that, but what I would say is I would balance it. I'd say it's a little bit of it is government and kind of federal, but I really think it's actually kind of a grassroots, ground-up consumer effort too. I think it has to come from both ways because I think it has to be a balanced approach because the incentives are a little bit different there. But that is one way of thinking about it, which is like having at a federal level having agencies that really think about that as a particular measure. The problem is that it is hard to actually get the metrics out there. Like GDP is an easy way of doing it because you can kind of do the math there. But compassion and the impact of that is hard to put a number around. I mean, you have all these safety agencies. You have the FDA. You have these things that are there to protect the consumer, but it's really tactical and operational, right? So it's a tough one to kind of quantify, but I think there is a way to balance it out with more grassroots efforts type of organizations. Yeah. Any other questions? Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.